Sonic's power levels in Archie Sonic comics are consistently off the charts, and honestly, it's a really good thing that he's on our side, because if he wasn't, we would be in serious trouble. But it's kind of fun to wonder what if he wasn't the hero that we know, and that's exactly what we're doing today. We're going to be taking a look at Sonic's devious double Scourge, but before he became Scourge, he was simply known as Evil Sonic. Evil Sonic made his debut when our Sonic was sprinting across the cosmic interstate. It's basically this twisting, branching road that connects all of the Sonic multiverse. He ended up taking a wrong turn and got lost in a strange new world. Here he stumbled upon a giant vet clinic, and to his shock he met this universe's Dr. Robotnik. But here's the twist. Robotnik here isn't a villain. He's actually a gentle vet who cares for all of Mobius's creatures. In fact, everyone here seems to love Robotnik and hates Sonic. So our blue blur decides to make a quick exit out of here, and it's then that he would meet this world's version of himself, who we would come to know as Evil Sonic. He's basically Sonic, but he wears sunglasses, a leather jacket, and leather boots, which honestly is wild for a guy who runs all the time. I mean, have you ever tried running in leather? It's not marathon gear, I'll tell you that. Evil Sonic explains that Sonic landed in a universe where Mobius is flipped upside down. He and his gang are the anti-freedom fighters, so they fight against freedom, and Dr. Robotnik is a pacifist vet. Ultimately, however, our Sonic ends up saving the day by tricking Evil Sonic into the vet clinic where he ends up getting captured. Then Sonic gets to go back home with a parting gift from Anti-Robotnik. It's basically a tool that lets him turn his version of Robotnik's goopy muck into harmless bubbles. It's a silly early Sonic comic, but it would branch off into so much more. Not long after, Sonic and his friends would encounter yet another Sonic. This time it was a cyborg Sonic from a universe where his version of Robotnik, known as Robo-Robotnik, whom you might remember from my Robotnik video, took over and turned everyone into cyborgs. Cyborg Sonic arrives with a dire warning. Robo-Robotnik is exploring the multiverse and he's scouting for new worlds to conquer, and he set his sights right on Sonic's Mobius. In response, Sonic recruits a whole slew of other Sonics from across the multiverse. The artists here clearly had an absolute blast creating all of these variations, and I'd love to know which ones are your favorite. Personally, I've got to say I'm a really big fan of Wolverine Sonic here. He's definitely high on my list. Robo-Robotnik, however, proves to be such a colossal threat that even the Prime Universe version of Robotnik ends up joining forces with Sonic. And of course, one Sonic couldn't miss the chance to be a part of all of this chaos, and that of course is Evil Sonic. He ends up getting recruited by Robo-Robotnik himself, proving that he's just bad enough to be recruited by the most evil version of Robotnik. This comic genuinely is honestly such a blast to read. Not only are the Sonic variants super fun to look at, but there's also this segment where they go into the neutral zone. It's a zone totally devoid of color, and the comic actually invites the reader to color it in themselves. It's a really cool and interactive moment for younger fans that makes me wonder why I've never seen something like this in comics before. In the neutral zone, Evil Sonic and Robo-Robotnik spots ambush the crew of Sonics, and it starts this epic fight while Robo-Robotnik builds his ultimate weapon. It is a massive destructive Borg, but in the end, not even this can stand a chance against an entire army of Sonics. After all, it's tough to beat a multiverse of plot armor hedgehogs. However, despite another loss, Evil Sonic would continue to be a thorn in Sonic's side, as he'd regularly show up to cause mischief. Such as the moments here where he, along with his anti-freedom fighters, showed up in Mobius disguised as their Prime Mobius counterparts, and they caused absolute havoc. I think the worst out of all of the havoc caused here is done by Anti-Rotor, who just straight up destroys a guy's shop with a baseball bat, and gives no real reason. At least everybody else had something kind of funny to say. Eventually, the freedom fighters would return and find that everybody has turned on them because they think that they are their evil counterparts. So they would devise a plan that honestly has not aged well at all, so just be warned. They decide, and it's their words, to disguise themselves as gypsies. And I know that this is a product of the time, but it's important to understand here that even though it wasn't super understood at the time, the costumes that they're wearing and the term gypsy is actually offensive, and that this term is actually a slur against Romani people. I don't think that they meant anything harmful from this comic, but my jaw did drop a little bit reading it with some modern day context. Anyways, a fight breaks out, and fortunately for the reader, the anti-squad decides to drop their disguises, which allows the freedom fighters to then wear their normal clothes, or rather not wear any clothes because they're almost always naked. Ultimately, the day is won after everybody ends up switching partners and fights a different anti-version of themselves, and it's here that we get to see Sonic's iconic meme line where he punches a lady. It's honestly so funny. Shenanigans with Evil Sonic go on for a while, but honestly, if you feel like you've had the gist of who Evil Sonic is and you just want to get to who Scourge is, you can jump to the time point right here in the video. Evil Sonic would show up yet again shortly after Prime Rotor showed off a gun to Prime Sonic. It's a small gun that can transform into a giant gun that has the ability to shoot through just about everything. And it makes me wonder, are we totally sure that these guys are the good guys if this is what they're making? Anyway, Evil Sonic would show up on the floating island along with a Scottish Knuckles, because for some reason Knuckles' evil counterpart is from Scotland? Or at least I think he's from Scotland. His dialogue sometimes reads like Irish, and to be totally honest, my childhood memories of him are being French, but I think it's just the Scottish tam that he was wearing that I thought was a beret. I don't know. I'm not some kind of cultural genius. The two anti-variants, however, would beat up Knuckles, and then they would steal the Master Emerald. So, Knuckles would have no choice but to join up with Sonic and friends, who would head to Anti-Mobius, where they would get jumped by Scottish Knuckles and Punk Sonic. However, Anti-Knuckles would stop fighting pretty quickly, and we would learn that this version of Knuckles is more of a pacifist, and he feels that he should have never resorted to violence in the first place. We would learn that the only reason he showed up in the Prime Universe with Anti-Sonic was to steal the Emerald because all of the Emerald's powers in Anti-Mobius are draining, and it is ruining Anti-Knuckles' island, who we would learn is not a floating island here, but rather it's an anti-floating island, which means it's a sunken island which is protected by a giant bubble, and air is leaking out of the sunken island. I actually really like the idea of the sunken island. It's really creative, I've got to say. So the gang decides to help the evil gang, and they head down to the sunken island. And it's here that we would learn that Anti-Knuckles might straight up be one of the worst guardians ever, as he somehow never realized that Prime Robotnik was here testing out a gun that was powered by this world's version of the Chaos Emeralds. Robotnik would then get his bots to launch everybody into the water one at a time, starting with Tails, who would have to swim through an ocean and fight sharks to get to safety. Like, what the heck? Evil Sonic would be next, and we would learn here that he had actually devised this plan with Robotnik. However, Robotnik, being Robotnik, is now turning on Evil Sonic. Evil Sonic would manage to escape from the bots, but not before everybody overheard him talk about how this was all originally part of a plan. So Rotor would head out to save Tails, which honestly is a great idea because I don't think there's any way that this boy is surviving, and everybody else would deal with Evil Sonic. Following this, they would then take on Robotnik by getting the Master Emerald, which somehow manages to redirect the blast from his gun, and it goes right back to him, causing everything except for this universe's version of the emeralds to vanish. Though they would make it really clear to us that Robotnik has not been killed by this blast, and instead the blast just sent him back to the Prime Universe. Anyway, the day is saved, and the emeralds are back to powering the island. Evil Sonic gets locked up, and everyone gets to go home. Interestingly, this actually marks the last time that we would ever see Anti-Mobius like this, because it's going to get a slight update, but we'll be back on that a little bit later. And Evil Sonic would go on to make most of his appearances from here on out in the Prime Universe. Evil Sonic would show up much later. He was having a tussle with Sonic the Zone Cop, another Sonic variant. And Sonic, just to give you a brief recap, is from a zone where basically all of the worst criminals from the multiverse are held. It's like a giant intergalactic prison. Sonic would show up and warn Sonic that Evil Sonic is on his way to wreak havoc once again. But luckily, before he could even do any harm, Antoine would end up knocking him out of all people. And he would actually do this because he thought that Evil Sonic was just Sonic in a disguise, because during this comic book, Sonic is trying to help Antoine impress his father. So, you know, a classic mix-up. Now we're into the final stretch of me having to say Evil Sonic, thankfully. Evil Sonic would again end up impersonating Sonic, and we would learn that, along with Anti-Antoine, who is now named Patch, they have taken over their Prime Universe's counterparts. And I've covered a little bit of this during my Bunny video if you want to learn more about Patch and what happens with him. After Evil Sonic knocked out Sonic and assumed his life, it would mostly just involve him hitting on every single woman he met, which is kind of wild. It would culminate with him canoodling with Bunny in the woods together, and it's not technically cheating because she was on a break because Evil Antoine had taken over Antoine's life and she didn't totally understand what was happening there. However, this is still really weird. It would culminate with them taking a nap together in the woods, and it's such a strange and bizarre comic. It straight up gives me the ick every time I read it. Following this, Evil Sonic would then meet with Rouge, and for some reason, she is drawn so terribly here. She's giving these goofy boob socks on her chest, but together the two of them would actually team up. They would work together to try and steal the Master Emerald, with Rouge working as a decoy, and Evil Sonic going to grab the booty. Which of course he means the emeralds. There could be no other booty that Evil Sonic is talking about here. Though Prime Sonic would thankfully swoop in, and the two would start to fight. Really wild, Evil Sonic is ready to bash in Prime Sonic's head. He's totally out for blood here. Though, luckily for Sonic, Knuckles' dad Locke would be able to come in and save the day with some chaos magic stuff. With that, Evil Sonic is yeeted out, and he and Rouge would actually form a team from here, which is pretty interesting, and I kind of wish we got to see more of them working together. Evil Sonic would show up again on he and Prime Sonic's birthday, where history would once again repeat itself, as he and Rouge would work together to try once again to steal the Master Emerald from Knuckles' dad. However, knowing that he cannot beat Locke, Evil Sonic resorts to an interesting tactic. He gets up on top of the Master Emerald, and as a birthday gift to himself, he supercharges himself using the Master Emerald's power. He ultimately gets himself punched off before he could really go overclocked here, but the damage was already done, and Evil Sonic is no more. What was left behind was Scourge, a green Sonic bearing scars on his chest, and honestly, I absolutely adore his look. This is such a cool looking variant. Following this, Scourge would actually take out Locke and he would be ready to kill him, but luckily Rouge is there to be the voice of reason and stop him. So instead, she and Scourge would actually chaos control out of there, and they would end up right by Sonic and Shadow, who have been busy fighting Crocbot, who, just quick aside, nobody takes him seriously, and I find it so funny because I have never taken him seriously either. But after taking out Crocbot, the three hedgehogs would then start to fight with a 2-on-1 rumble, and Scourge actually manages to hold himself off pretty well here, though Scourge knows when he has been licked, and he ends up fleeing with Rouge into what is almost too convenient, a giant floating warp ring in the forest. However, not wanting to look a gift horse in the mouth and knowing that the alternative is getting beat up, the two end up jumping into the warp ring, and they narrowly escape to Dr. Finitevus' lair, where they would be offered a job by the Mad Doctor. Together, along with the Destructics, who are basically just an evil gang, they would end up breaking into Eggman's egg grape facility. And shortly after this, Rouge would split from the group after finding out Dr. Finitevus was planning on using old gun weapons to cause absolute havoc. Because Rouge is actually pretty okay with rescuing Echidnas who had been captured by Eggman. However, she is definitely not okay with causing an all-out missile warfare on the planet. Scourge, however, would stick with Dr. Finitevus. However, he would be absent for a while Dr. Finitevus was working on his own big plan. However, Scourge would end up showing up at one of the worst time possible, when Sonic was having some drama with his at-the-time girlfriend Fiona Fox. With Scourge here, Fiona would drop her act, and we would be shown that she is much more into the bad boy persona, so of course she ends up gravitating more towards Scourge rather than Sonic, and we would learn that she had been secretly dating Scourge instead of Sonic. To make matters even worse, Tails ends up flying in here, and in a really pathetic display where they really do my boy dirty, he starts to just beg while he sobs to Fiona not to join up with Scourge. And while in tears, he would get one of the biggest slaps in Archie Sonic from Fiona. And low-key, this panel is so funny to me. I mean, looking at it for this video, I never noticed that in the background that Scourge is laughing, and it's so comically evil, but it fits him so well. I just love it. Anyway, a fight would break out, and while downed, Scourge would explain to Sonic that all he needs is one bad day for him to end up just like him. However, Sonic would spin the tables after knocking Scourge down and explain that Scourge just needs a bit less selflessness for him to end up just like Sonic. Anywho, after some more fighting, the two end up leaving through a warp ring, and they leave Sonic, Tails, and Amy to head home. From here, Scourge and Fiona would continue to work alongside with Dr. Finitevus, who managed to get control of the Master Emerald, and was filling it up with all kinds of negative chaos energy. Things would start to get pretty heated for Dr. Finitevus, as everybody he had working with him would slowly start to turn on him one by one. And also during this time, Fiona went through a costume change, so this is what Fiona looks like now, just to remind you that she is in fact evil. However, people turning on him wouldn't bother Dr. Finitevus, as his job was complete, and to the absolute shock of both Scourge and Fiona, who were actually two of his most loyal followers, they would be faced with the demigod Enerjack, who had taken over Knuckles. If you want to learn more about that, I've got videos on Enerjack, and I've also got a video on Finitevus. Things would start to get pretty heated, and to their credit, both Scourge and Fiona stuck around even longer as they helped Finitevus defend the Emerald against Sonic and his friend. But ultimately, enough is enough, and after seeing Super Sonic, powered up by the Master Emerald, duking it out with Enerjack, everyone Finitevus had left dipped out, and Scourge and Fiona would dip to another universe, as they would use their warp ring that Scourge had previously supercharged to return to Scourge's home dimension to cause some absolute mayhem there. So what would Scourge get up to when he returned home? Well, to put it most simply, he took over, and he sits now as the self-appointed king of Anti-Mobius. One thing you might notice here is that all of the anti-variations of well-known characters got a much-needed redesign from their previous leather-clad outfits, and I'm really glad that they did. They also don't call themselves the Anti-Freedom Fighters anymore, and instead have gone with the name Suppression Squad, which works a lot better. Now, the Suppression Squad would assemble a device that allowed them to warp into the Prime Universe, and they would assault Freedom HQ directly. To make matters worse, during this time, Sonic would be gone with Knuckles' Chaotix, and that meant that the Freedom Fighters would have to fight without their iconic blue blur. Through all of this mayhem and chaos, Rotor would eventually be able to call out to Sonic for help, and just as Sonic gets there, Scourge would make it known that he is ready to fight, because he's absolutely one for dramatic entrances here when he finally steps through the portal and joins the fun. An all-out brawl would start, and Scourge would do a pretty good job at fighting against his Prime counterpart, though he would nearly get knocked back into his own dimension. And it's here that we would see that Scourge is king in title only. He's actually not really great at giving his people orders, and if anything, they don't really seem to have any respect for them. He's just mad that he almost got knocked back into his universe. With no other choice, Sonic and his Freedom Fighters are actually pushed out of their own HQ, and they lose to the Suppression Squad. There weren't any major injuries here or anything like that, but it's still a pretty big hit to the ego, and it's wild that they actually lost their home. While living in their new home, the Suppression Squad would be introduced to Metal Sonic, and honestly, his introduction is so funny to me, because it's just Metal Sonic standing outside of the door as Anti-Tails calls out to Scourge. It makes me think of a little kid coming over to their friend's house and asking if their friend can come out and play. It's so goofy. Scourge would initially brush off Metal and explain that Sonic doesn't live here anymore, though Metal Sonic isn't actually all that picky and he's ready to fight any variant of Sonic, regardless of their color. We'd get a good look at the lack of respect that I had previously mentioned that Scourge has from his Suppression Squad, as Anti-Tails would just sit back and watch as Scourge takes an absolute beating from Metal. And of course, Scourge's hubris is way too big for him to admit that he needs any kind of help, though luckily for him, Sonic actually swoops in and gives Metal Sonic a spin dash. Sonic, ever the optimist, tries to actually form a truce with Scourge here as they take on Metal, but Scourge just isn't having it as he slaps him away and leaves Sonic in the middle of two evil Sonics. Scourge would eventually knock Sonic down, and in a really interesting moment, Scourge would reach out to Sonic and offer him a chance to join him. Together, they can combine their insane force and become unstoppable kings as they conquer the planet. What I find really interesting here is that Sonic, for at least a moment, doesn't actually have an answer, as he can't seem to find any words to say, and it might show a little bit of weakness in his character, or it might just show that he was shocked by this approach. We would never get to totally hear what Sonic might have said in this moment, as Metal would come in and hit Scourge. And if you thought that we didn't already have enough reskins in this video, well, you better watch out, because Eggman built a Metal Scourge, who also arrives here to give Metal Sonic some backup. Finally, Scourge agrees to take Sonic up on that truce, and together they fight against their Metal counterparts. Though, honestly, they aren't doing so hot here. During this fight, the Suppression Squad would watch as we get a glimpse of how brutal of a ruler Scourge is, considering that he is the reason that Patch now wears an eye patch, and he is also the reason that he is king over Alicia, who is their version of Sally, meaning that Scourge did something to their version of King Max. Miles, who is the name of the Anti-Tails, is far less afraid of Scourge, and it's here that he begins to plot a way to remove Scourge from the picture entirely. Now, during this fight against the Metals, I have to say I really like Metal Scourge's design. I think they did such a good job at incorporating Scourge's key elements into a Metal Sonic, and it's unfortunate here that he is so criminally underutilized. Eventually, Scourge would get over his inflated ego and he would call out to his Suppression Squad to come help him. And with the help of the Suppression Squad, both bots would be decapitated. And like I said, he's underutilized, so this is the last time we actually ever see Metal Scourge, which is a real shame. Scourge would again offer Sonic the same deal, but this time, with time to have thought about it, Sonic would quickly reject it, and he would be off, as he knows that there's no way he's taking back Freedom HQ on his own. Now later that night, Scourge would actually break into Sonic's home, and it's here that he would meet Sonic's father, who was just sitting there. Jules explains that he has already died once to save Sonic's life, and he is willing to do it again, which is just such a baller line. Jules has zero fear of any of the bravado that Scourge brings to the table, and he explains that the Prime Universe is full of heroic beings, and if Scourge comes from an opposite world, then that must mean that it's full of cowards, and he goes full on just insulting Scourge to his face. This absolutely infuriates Scourge, who claims that he has conquered a planet on his own, but Jules tells him that this is just a different brand of ruination, and we would get a glimpse of what Anti-Mobius was like for Scourge as a child, which is really interesting. Anti-Jules brought a time known as the Great Peace, but this was nothing but a face. The world actually ended up falling apart 10 years later, and what's really interesting is we see a poster on the wall reading Scourge. I'm not totally sure if this 10 years later time skip was supposed to be from when Scourge came back and took over, or if there's something else here and that maybe Anti-Jules and the name Scourge have some kind of link, which would mean that there's something deeper to Scourge's name that he chose. Unfortunately, we would never really get to learn much more about this. But Scourge, in a not-so-subtle way, would hint to the readers that his dad isn't alive anymore, and it's pretty heavily suggested that Scourge is the reason for this. Scourge gets ready to attack Jules, and this causes Jules to get up and push Scourge back. And he talks about how he's fought on the front lines, and he is not ready to go quietly. Jules actually manages to intimidate Scourge into leaving, and Scourge actually leaves with tears in his eyes. It's a really powerful moment that causes me to really want to learn more about who Scourge is and his past, because I actually feel a little bit for him. By all counts, Scourge is an identical copy to Sonic, who was just dealt an awful hand in life by being born, purely coincidentally, into an evil variant universe. With Scourge gone, Jules would close the window and Sonic's mom would come to ask who Jules was talking to which Jules would just coldly respond to with nobody. It sends shivers down my spine when I read that line. It's just so awesome. We don't get to see Sonic's dad being badass very often, but this is just such a stellar example of it. Not much later, Sonic and Amy would end up into Scourge's home dimension, and during this time, the Freedom Fighters would go on and assault Freedom HQ. However, to their shock, Miles would propose an alliance between them and the Suppression Squad. He would explain the atrocities that Scourge did to their planet, and for some reason, he renamed their planet to Mobius with an E inside of it, so I don't know, Moebius? It's kind of silly. He's also the one who forced them to change their clothes, which I think is kind of funny. With no other option to rid the world of these evil variants, Sally would agree to this plan, and together they would devise a way to kick Scourge out. In the evil universe, Sonic and Amy would come across Amy's double, who is Rosie the Rascal, and yeah, she's not alright. Rosie, like Amy, went through the same magical procedure to make herself older. However, this twisted version shattered her psyche and left her a sadistic maniac who breaks anything that looks like Scourge. Now, back in the Prime Universe, Miles would come running to Freedom HQ with the Freedom Fighters fast on him. To Scourge and Fiona, it appears that Miles was fleeing from the Freedom Fighters, but it was quickly made apparent that Miles was not working for his supposed king. Meanwhile, Sonic and Amy would find their way back to the Prime Universe just in time to be welcomed to the gong show that is Freedom HQ. Surprisingly, Scourge and Fiona are doing pretty alright at holding back the traitors, with Scourge even taking out a large portion of them on his own. And he does this really cool, crazy upside-down spin kick against Tails and Miles, which is just great. I also adore the line where he says, "You could have served the baddest king ever, now you're just gonna get served," which is so corny, but it's just so much fun as well. Unfortunately, this joint effort would be time-sensitive, as Rosie found herself interested in smashing portals from the other side. In a double-crossing twist, the Suppression Squad would attack both Sonic and Scourge as they would both be launched into the portal with Amy before shutting it down, leaving the trio trapped with the twisted doppelganger of Amy who strikes fear in even Scourge's eyes. In Moebius, the Hedgehog trio would deal with Rosie before finally Scourge turns his attention onto Sonic, and listen, things get really crazy really fast here, so just stay with me. As Sonic and Scourge rush towards each other, Shadow suddenly chaos controls in, and I kid you not, he's not even alone here. Coming with Shadow is Metal, who is also here, so now we've got a four-way standoff against Sonic lookalikes, but that's not all. So it turns out that Silver has actually come to the past to hunt down Sonic, and along with Amy's cousin who looks suspiciously like Sonic, whose name is Robbo Hedge, they also end up showing up here. And so we get this really great full art page where all 7 characters are just in this absolute brawl, and I think the best part is Silver's absolute confusion, as he was for sure not expecting to fall into this insanity. Silver has enough of this, and he uses his telekinesis to freeze everyone in place as he asks who Sonic is. And we get this really funny moment where both Scourge and Sonic point at each other, and I mean, technically, neither of them are wrong. However, Robbo Hedge ends up convincing Silver that Sonic is actually a good guy, and thankfully, we don't have to go through a comic version of Sonic 06's plot. Sonic then also manages to convince Metal to have a temporary truce and take out Scourge. Rosie is equally convinced to join as she's promised to get the final smashing on Scourge, and this leaves Scourge in the middle of 7 hedgehogs who are ready to take him on. To a lesser hedgehog, this might have been a moment where he would admit that he was beat, but Scourge is anything but a lesser hedgehog, and he always has one more trick up his sleeve. So after taking a beating, Scourge rushes to his throne, and it's here that we would learn that it's full of Anarchy Barrels, which is Moebius' version of the Chaos Emeralds. And you kind of have to ignore the fact that we've previously seen Chaos Emeralds here, and we just have to accept that Anarchy Barrels are a thing that exist. In a truly epic moment, Scourge goes super as he exclaims, "All hail the king, baby," and I just love it so much. It's so cheese, but it is so good. His super form also might legit be one of my favorites. I wish that we got more different colors. Instead, we often see things like the traditional gold, but I really like the purple look on him instead. Now, back in the Prime Universe, the Suppression Squad and the Freedom Fighters finally decide to come to the Anti-Universe, and the Suppression Squad more or less just assumes that Scourge by this point is going to have been defeated. But I guess they didn't expect 5 other hedgehogs to show up. They also didn't seem to expect Scourge to go super, and literally everybody is defeated when they arrive. They show up to a very grim sight, with Scourge clearing everyone out and holding Sonic up by the neck. Try as they might, the Suppression Squad and Freedom Fighters would be no match for Scourge, and if anything, they really only managed to buy Sonic some more time to devise a plan. Or rather, more time to get beat up by Metal Sonic, that is. Until Shadow rushes in and Chaos controls him out of there. And I'm not joking, if you want to know what happens next, you can check out my video on the Sonic X comic, because this crosses over with Sonic X. Silver's telekinesis wouldn't be enough to take out Scourge, and in a final effort everybody would attempt to dogpile on Scourge, but in this super form there's no stopping him. So finally, Sonic comes up with a plan and he lures Scourge out of the castle, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how amazingly drawn the art is here. They did an absolutely wonderful job with all of these really dark and heavy shadows in the rain, and Sonic genuinely looks really terrified. Sonic manages to convince Scourge to depower himself to prove that he is the superior hedgehog even without the Anarchy barrels, and Scourge does because he's got such a big head. But when he does this, he ends up way too exhausted to do anything, and this always struck me as lazy writing because they couldn't seem to figure a way out of it. It could have been a really exciting fight, but Sonic just explains that the Chaos Emeralds leave him feeling pretty energized when he powers down, and so he assumed that the opposite version would leave Scourge feeling exhausted. It's dumb, but I mean, whatever. With that, Sonic and gang are ready to leave, and this time they're actually taking Scourge with them. And also, Anti-Eggman is skinny. I didn't get the chance to mention this previously, but it's kind of a funny opposite version of Eggman. So Sonic would head out into the Cosmic Interstate, and he would plan to bring Scourge to Sonic, but Scourge would break free, and a final fight would happen. But unfortunately, this fight doesn't last long, as Zector would show up, and he would arrest both Sonic and Scourge. The two of them are taken to the No Zone, where the prison is kept, and here everybody who isn't from this universe is placed vertically. So Scourge would once again break free, and Sonic would have to team up with Sonic, who would allow him to stand horizontally on this plane. Though Scourge would cause some chaos, it would be pretty short-lived, and he would end up getting caught and brought into custody. Although from this point Sonic would never see Scourge again, he would have a long-lasting impact on Sonic, as Sonic would find himself reminded of his words where he explains that Sonic is just one bad day away from being just as bad as he is, and it really hits him when he's down. Speaking of being hit while you're down, Scourge's life just straight up sucks in prison. He has found himself on the receiving end of multiple beatdowns, and he's gone from an absolute warlord to a joke of a character who is now referred to as Snot. It's tough. What's even tougher is that Scourge has went from leading the baddest of the bad to having Horizontal and Vertical hanging out with him. They're really deep cuts to longtime readers. They were kind of a joke villain super early on in Archie, and if their appearance isn't enough to give it away, they're not taken seriously by anyone. We learned from the warden here, Zobotnik, that he has been making sure that Scourge gets it extra tough here, and when he finds out that 5 Prime Universe inmates who have ties to Scourge are joining, he gets ready to make their lives just as difficult. These new inmates are Fiona Fox and some of the Destructics that we've seen work alongside with Scourge up until now. Upon learning that people from the Prime Universe are coming, Scourge is initially shocked, though he ends up stopped by his cellmate Smalls the Cat, who is 100% a reference to the rapper Biggie Smalls, and it makes me just so happy that we have 2 rapper-influenced Sonic characters with Sleuth Doggy Dog and Smalls the Cat. It's funny. However, before Smalls can do anything to Scourge, he ends up interrupted by Sergeant Simeon, and it's here that it's made clear that Scourge is under the protection of the Destructics. Oh, also, Fiona is now in charge of the Destructics, so she's really found her own since splitting up with Scourge. And right after this, Fiona gets straight to being cutesy with her boo. Scourge lashes out on her though, exclaiming that all this attention that he is getting is going to get him killed. Scourge rushes out of there, and he is very clearly rattled by something, and it's here that he comes across Anti-Jeffrey St. John, who here is named Jeffrey St. Quack, and he tells Scourge that the king wants to see him, and Scourge is left without much choice. The king here in prison is King Max from the Anti-Universe, and we learn that Scourge had actually usurped him, so now he's stuck here running a gang in prison. The real reason why Scourge has been such a pushover is that Max has threatened to send his gang after him and rip him limb from limb if he ever tries something on him again. King Max here is straight up brutal, and with the arrival of the Destructics, Max is feeling threatened, so he orders his men to take out Scourge. Scourge would go to show that his flame isn't completely extinguished as he takes out Jeffrey with a headbutt, and although he ends up taking a beating, he is once again rescued by the Destructics. One thing I really like here is that Fiona tells Max that Scourge belongs to her and her Destructics, which really just shows a shift in dynamics here. In Scourge's cell, we get to learn that the inhibitor rings that everybody wears dampens their powers, and that's the reason why Scourge doesn't have access to his super speed or his strength. It's caused Scourge to pretty much give everything up here as everyone is against him. Fiona ends up selling Scourge on a new plan though, and she didn't bring the Destructics here for Scourge to befriend them. They're here for one purpose, and that's to be a gang of cannon fodder for Scourge as they find their way out of here. Scourge can essentially toss them aside whenever he wants and take all of their glory as bragging rights. With that, Scourge is back, and with a pep talk from Fiona, he is ready to enact some revenge. Alright, so Scourge ends up meeting with Warden Zobotnik, who, after showing Scourge some footage of how the Destructics got here, he tells Scourge that the Destructics are too much for him. They are much more intense than Scourge's suppression squad, and more or less Zobotnik is worried that Scourge will be broken by the Destructics, which feels like foreshadowing to me. Scourge agrees to keep his nose clean, and from here on out, Zobotnik thinks that Scourge is turning into a force for good. Although Scourge is still Scourge, and we would learn that through his thoughts, he's got no intentions to do anything good here. From here, Scourge would go and see each of the Destructics to make a deal with them. He would convince them to join up with him in a prison break, and Scourge is still chumming it up with Alan Cal, while acting like a weakling in the public eye. Jeffrey St. Croix ends up beating up Alan Cal, who would prompt Scourge to run in and protect their backs. It's actually pretty cool to see. Although Scourge did a pretty good job at taking out Jeffrey, he would struggle and take a beating from Fiona, who we would learn is now working in secret for Anti-King Max. The goal here is to keep up an appearance, and so nobody suspects that they are working together. Scourge then would go to a group therapy meeting which is run by Zouge the Bat, and while at therapy, Scourge would egg everyone on, telling them that they deserve revenge, and hype them up to the point where they would start a riot in the therapy room. Following this, during the night, Fiona would be greeted by Flying Frog, who Scourge convinced to work with him as well, along with Lightning Lynx. The two of them managed to break Fiona out, and together they scale their way up to the control room where they manage to take everyone out and set everyone loose. On top of being set loose, the control collars are disabled for the Destructics and Scourge, which allow them to use their full power. With this, Scourge is back, and he beats up Smalls as he takes revenge for the absolute pummeling he's received from him. Scourge makes his way out of prison in a pretty cool looking torn up prison uniform. It's an awesome design, I have to say. Scourge actually has an interesting plan to get his Destructics and their gear back, and it involves the goofballs Alan Cal. Scourge would remove their collars, which causes the two to turn into their evil god forms, and we're reminded that despite being joke characters, they have ample reason to be here just like any of the other evil characters. Through a good deal of chaos and combat in what are some really fun panels, Scourge would manage to fight his way through just about everyone, and I love how he gets his confidence back while beating up prisoners and guards alike. And then he calls out for everyone to bow before him. Scourge's confidence is at an all-time high here. During this time, Anti-Max and Jeffrey would have taken all of the Destructics and Scourge's things, as they would accidentally end up activating a warp ring while trying to figure out how to get out of here. We would also learn that Jeffrey is totally ready to overthrow Max, so, I mean, everybody from the Anti-Universe seems ready to turn on him. However, it's too little too late for Jeffrey and the King here, as the Destructics would get there and take them out. Just as the Zone Cops would start to take back control over their prisoners, Scourge would get ready to dip, and he would actually abandon Alan Cal, who were really instrumental to helping him out, but Scourge is really ready just to throw everyone aside, so it sucks to be them. That's what you get for dealing with Scourge. Zobotnik might have stopped Scourge if not for the Destructics, and with that, they managed to make an escape through the warp ring. This is actually a really fun arc to read, and I didn't talk about it much during my last Scourge video, and I can understand why. This story, like many other Archie stories, ends on a cliffhanger. Zobotnik would send Sonic after Scourge, and Scourge would be the new leader of the Destructics, with some hint of something big that was about to transpire between Scourge and Finitevus. But we would never actually get to see any of that, as all of these characters would be erased by the Super Genesis wave. And so with that, unfortunately, we're on an anticlimactic level where we are now at the end of the video because there is nothing left to say about Scourge. I hope you enjoyed this video though. It was a lot of fun to revisit Scourge, and I actually started working on this video right after finishing my Surge video, so it's been really interesting to compare how both Scourge and Surge stand up to each other. Forever ago, I ended up talking about Surge when she was first introduced, and I assumed that she was just going to be an IDW Scourge, but really there is no replacement for this truly evil variant of Sonic. If you enjoyed this, I would greatly appreciate a like, a comment, a subscribe, or whatever. But as always, I'm not your boss, and I just hope that you have a good one.